I was watching this and thinking, this could be like a Calvin Klein ad. It honestly looks like they got a bunch of male models to portray this sequence.
Have they not seen the biblically accurate?
I know. It's like they're not even trying.
Wheels within wheels and eyes all around the wheels. I mean, we can afford not to do spoiler alert on this one. The book's been around for 3,000 years.
All right.
They believed that Yahweh or El had a wife, Asherah, and a son, Baal, and they ruled together. So the Israelites have bought into this idea that you need to have a divine family. The book actually suggests that David was an embarrassment to the family because he wasn't entirely right in the head.
G'day and welcome to another episode of Science Radio. My name's Jesse, and today I get to welcome for the very first time writer for Science and a long-time friend, Mitchell Strawn. G'day, Mitch.
Hey, how you been?
Very well. How about yourself?
Can't complain too much.
Very good. You are a first-time writer for Science, but you are not a first-time writer. You are a thinker, pastor, teacher. I was going to go into some sort of candlestick maker joke there, but the rhyming just wouldn't work. But
I have to correct you. Technically speaking, I've never been a pastor. I've been a pastoral worker.
Well, we are all ministers, as a mentor of mine once said. But with that, do you want to just give the good people the quick 10-second bio? Who is Mitch?
I have lived all over. I was born in New Zealand, spent some time in Papua New Guinea. I'd call myself a native of Sydney, but I've been travelling for a fair bit. Currently make Toowoomba my home. Currently working as a teacher at Darling Downs Adventist College. And yeah, I feel incredibly lucky to be able to do that. I'm surrounded by wonderful people, and I couldn't feel more blessed.
The first thing that you've written for us, and hopefully not the last, is a review of a TV series that has recently been making waves. It's Amazon Prime's House of David. And I don't know about you, but I remember when this was first announced, the discourse was very much around, hey, here's a biblical kind of Game of Thrones series. It was definitely touted as a more mature, grown-up version of the kids' stories that many of us church people grew up listening to and seeing. The title of your article is "I Watched House of David So You Don't Have To." And it's a little bit of a clickbaity title because I don't think you necessarily want to steer people away from watching the show themselves if they want to. But do you want to kind of give us a little bit of a sense of your sort of, 40,000 foot view of the show overall? How would you describe it to somebody who maybe isn't familiar with the subject material or just wants to know if it's worth their time?
Yeah, I mean, you describe it as a grown-up, mature version of the Bible story. And look, it's certainly mature, but I wouldn't necessarily call it grown-up. From what I've seen, and I guess we should acknowledge going straight in that it doesn't claim to be historically accurate. It has a big disclaimer at the start of every episode saying we have taken creative liberties, we've taken liberties with the history, we've taken liberties with the Bible story. We hope that this is a faithful retelling with these liberties that we've taken. So understanding that, you have to know what you're getting into, and that is not a documentary. And in some cases, it's better for that. Documentaries don't have the emotional pathos that House of David has. It doesn't have the engagement. It doesn't invite you to ask, what does David's experience look like compared to your own? And I must say, as someone for whom David is my favorite Bible character, I very much was looking forward to this. And there were some elements of the show that I really enjoyed, that I very much saw myself in David in some cases. So by no means am I saying it's a bad show. Like, it's got a lot of craft, a lot of care put into it. But as a historian and as a Bible scholar, I felt a little uneasy about some of the choices made. And as someone who enjoys good film, good television, I don't watch much television, so what I do watch, I want to be good. And I felt that there was a lot of stuff that was added or that was interpreted in such a way as to create more drama rather than to tell a story, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, so I guess the thing that we should acknowledge out of the gate is season 1 of House of David isn't trying to encapsulate the entire story of David. It's really just trying to encapsulate, from memory, is it 2 or 3 chapters of the story from First Samuel. It's a relatively tiny chunk of David's story relative to his entire arc. So basically, we have David's origin as a little shepherd boy just up to his confrontation with Goliath, which is, I guess, what most people know the story of David as being about. But obviously, it's so much more than that. Do you want to, for people who aren't familiar with the story, kind of give what would be your interpretation or your retelling of that part of David's story, knowing what you know about the history, knowing what you know about the biblical themes and all that sort of stuff?
So one thing that I think the House of David does well is trying to provide historical context for why David was chosen as king of Israel and what led to him becoming as prominent as he did outside of the Bible story. And to be clear, there's a lot of history that contributes to our understanding of the story of David. For example, we get to see glimpses of the Philistines not just being a rival nation, but perhaps the people that don't belong in Canaan. They are understood. We understand the Philistines to be possibly Cretan, possibly Cypriot, possibly even Greek. And you can tell a little bit of this influence without it being terribly overstated. They feel just alien enough that you should recognize they're not the people that God has chosen, but not so alien that they don't belong in the story. If that makes sense. What I didn't like more so is how they portrayed the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites, as we note in the article, it comes from the word bloodlickers. So it carries with it the idea that the Amalekites do not eat like the Israelites. They do not prepare their food like the Israelites. They do not have the same practices as the Israelites. Now, there could be any number of reasons for this. Now, the Amalekites being from the south of Israel would most likely have been semi-nomadic herders of cattle, sheep, more so sheep, goats. Cattle were a little bit too big to really be sustained by the land out there. Now, if you look at other semi-nomadic pastoral societies, you see that eating the blood is part of what they did in order for nourishment. The Mongols, for example, when they were on horseback, they would cut a small slit in the skin of their horses. They would drink their horses' blood while they were riding the horses so as to nourish themselves on long journeys. So we see that drinking blood in a herding context isn't necessarily out of place, if that makes sense. But for the Jews, for the Israelites, it would have been a gross violation of their eating rules because the Israelites were not permitted to eat the blood, to drink the blood. If they slaughtered an animal, the animal had to have all the blood drained, and especially in cases of their rituals, their ceremonies, the blood was actually supposed to be used to forgive their sins. That was part of their ritual stuff. So when the Israelites look at the Amalekites to see them drinking blood, that's the absolute antithesis to everything the Israelites stand for. The Israelites give up the blood as a means of getting rid of their sin, and the Amalekites drink the blood, which almost seems to make them more sinful, if that makes sense.
So how are the Amalekites portrayed in the show, for those people who haven't seen the show?
So the Amalekites are portrayed almost as semi-savages, if not savage outright. A lot of war paint, a lot of cracked white paint all over their faces, jagged teeth Agag, the king of the Amalekites. He's very much portrayed more as a shaman, and he's seen to be casting spells, which we don't really have any text for in the Bible evidence, although there may be something in the Jewish extra-biblical tradition about that. To me, it comes across as a little bit iffy.
Is it that it's kind of I know Orientalist is not quite the right terminology, but I think you mentioned in the article that there's a sort of almost equation with, I mean, we're in the South Pacific, right? We are familiar in the South Pacific with South Pacific island nations whose tribes often are cannibalistic, and they are also some of those tribes well known for wearing these kinds of war paints.
That was my first thought too. I saw that and I'm like, this is not what cultures from the area of Palestine were like. That's not how they portrayed themselves. This is a convention that's been put in place so that it can communicate something about how bad these people were. Unfortunately, that draws on our pre-existing prejudices of less developed tribes. And I think that's a little bit iffy, if you ask me, because I know people who have connections with those sort of tribes. And yes, it's not how we do things as Westerners. And no, I don't think that those tribes live the most wholesome lifestyle they possibly can. But we would do better than to use that as a shorthand for barbaric savages. Right. I think it's incredibly disrespectful.
It's a westernized stereotype almost, right? Yeah. Okay, so the Amalekites they formed the sort of early conflict in basically the first episode, but they are on the back foot. They are defeated in the first episode. So sorry, spoilers for people who haven't watched, but it's one of the many nations that the Israelites overcome in their conquest of Canaan. They kind of stick around. I won't spoil exactly how they stick around, but the specter, let's say, of the Amalekites does linger throughout the show, but it's not.
I mean, we can afford not to do spoiler alert on this one. The book's been around for 3,000 years.
All right, that's fine. It's
David does, in fact, before he becomes king, go up against Amalekites just before he becomes king. So they should come back.
True. Okay, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. So they will actually make a return, and that'll be a nice callback then when that happens potentially in season 2 or 3 if we get that.
One thing that's also worth keeping in mind too is that the Amalekites are very much not just a people group, but they are a symbol for the Jewish nation, of those who would do them harm when the Jews haven't deserved it. So obviously the Israelites' first experience with the Amalekites was when they were coming out in Exodus chapter 17, I believe it is, and they're the oldest, the slowest are attacked at the end of the caravan of Israelites coming out by the Amalekites. This is completely unwarranted, unprovoked, and there is enmity between the Amalekites and the Israelites ever since because of this behavior. And there are 2 commands in the Bible, in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. One is to blot out the memory of Amalek. The other one is to remember Amalek always. They're 2 contradictory things, and explaining that has been very much an exercise of the Jewish and, to a lesser extent, Christian commentators for the last 3,000 years. What does it mean to blot out the memory of Amalek and yet to remember them at the same time? Is it a call to make sure that justice is always done, yet never to forget the reasons why we might need to do justice, for example? Is it a reminder that our people must always be kept safe, therefore destroy utterly those who might go against you for no reason? Yet to remember that you must always be vigilant. This is the discussion that might be happening in some more right-wing fundamentalist Jewish circles, Zionist circles at the moment as the Gazan war goes on. So we must understand that the Amalekites are very much a figure that loom large in Israelite history. And we needn't forget, of course, that in the book of Esther, Haman is a descendant of the Amalekite king that we meet. He's an Agagite. So he's from Agag's family. And he, yet again, tries to destroy the Israelites, the Jews, without cause.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot of deep and rich history in this. And I understand that it's not really within the remit of the show, but I hope that we get to see some of that come back, the enduring conflict between Israel and Amalek and what that looks like in the life of David.
I want to just touch on, I guess we've mentioned that there's one show that kind of looms over this, and that's Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
And I think, at least from my perspective, Game of Thrones, at least the earlier seasons, and as much as the showrunners were sticking to the books fairly religiously, I think the show really succeeded because it was drawing on history, but it wasn't necessarily constrained by history. When you watched a lot of the conflicts with these fictional characters, you got to see some of the same historical beats happen in a way that was fun and exciting. And I think that House of David is trying to do that a little bit, but it's challenged by the fact that there is established history that it has to deal with. The other show that you mentioned that also looms over this, which probably most people will think of before they think of Game of Thrones, is The Chosen, which arguably has an even more difficult job of trying to render history that is much closer to the heart of Christians worldwide. And in many ways succeeds where House of David doesn't. Now, we could probably talk all day about the comparison between The Chosen and House of David, but what do you see as kind of being the ways in which The Chosen succeeds where perhaps House of David doesn't?
So one thing we need to understand as well is that The Chosen still is quite divisive in terms of what it offers to the Christian or the Christian adjacent viewer. Now, I personally quite like Chosen. I think it looks at the best of the history that we have and makes a considered judgment call about how to portray certain events of Jesus' life. And it's not afraid of adding scenes that weren't necessarily in the Bible if it would give context to how Jesus might have gone about doing something or what he might have meant when he gave a certain teaching. Now, to be clear, there's something we need to understand about The Chosen. It is not a substitute for the Gospels. And this is something that I think gives a lot of well-meaning and conservative traditional Christians a fair bit of pause, because they're looking at The Chosen and they're expecting it to be a faithful adaptation, a faithful portrayal of the life of Jesus. But just like the Bible is an infinite book, like one person can read one thing out of it, another person can read another thing out of it. I think we need to understand that The Chosen is itself an interpretation of the Gospels, not a retelling of the Gospels, not an adaptation of the Gospels, if that makes sense. It's very much Dallas Jenkins's idea of what Jesus meant as the product of his own personal Bible study, which we are well within our rights to disagree with if we so choose. And I think that's the way in which The Chosen has to be looked at. But having said that, it was born out of Dallas Jenkins' dream to tell the story of Jesus using television. Obviously, television has very much been in a golden age for the last 10 years, and we have Game of Thrones, as a matter of fact, to thank for that. It was very much the flagship series, that Breaking Bad as well, that brought us into an understanding that television isn't just something we sit down in front of with our dinner in order to not have to talk to our family. It is something that can tell a heartbreaking, deep, pathos-filled story.
On the same level as cinema, perhaps.
Perhaps even more so, because you have a budget that can bear it, and you have time to really develop the relationships between the characters and their motivations. One need only look at the 2-season Andor that's just come out versus Rogue One, and how it makes Rogue One better by adding to it. And you can do that when you've got television. And I think that's the real benefit of having something like The Chosen, which is a story that's been told over seasons. You've got tens of hours of runtime to tell the story of Jesus, where in a movie you might have maybe 4 hours at the most. You have time to dig into things. You have time to look into the important things that might have been skipped for time if you had less of it. So The Chosen is a story that aims to let the story of Jesus breathe. It's a labor of love. Dallas Jenkins has put a lot of work into it, and he wants to tell the story of Jesus using television as a medium. Where I feel the House of David comes in, it's kind of the opposite. And I mentioned this in the article. I say that House of David is trying to use the story of David to make television. And I see this very much in the way that characters are introduced, how they're fleshed out, how there are things that are done simply to increase the drama that I didn't think needed to be there to raise the stakes that are already pretty high if you look at the Israelite text. So I see it as trying to do something that didn't necessarily need to be done. If that makes sense.
Do you think it could have been better as a movie? Or a series of movies, perhaps?
I'd say, yes, series of movies. You can't do the story of David in just one movie. You can't do that in 2 hours, 3 hours. And by the same token, though, House of David is only adapting the first few chapters of David's life. And there's not really enough on there to make 8 hours of television. You have to invent stuff. And while I've said I'm not averse to doing that if it helps to flesh out the historical context, if it helps to give understanding as to what was going on culture-wise, all of that sort of stuff. I see decisions that have been made that don't really feel authentic to the world of the ancient Near East. I see, obviously, giants is a big pill to swallow for a lot of people. We have an understanding of gigantism even today. Like we've got, Andre the Giant as one of the most famous giants in recent history. So you could very much say this is a family of giants. Now, the reason why they are giants is an interpretation that has been held by some Christians. So the explanation that is given by Goliath's mother, who is an invented character, is that the fallen angels saw human women, liked what they saw in human women, and decided to make human women their consorts. And as a result of this, the giants were born. This is an interpretation of an account in early Genesis. I think it's Genesis 5. The offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men are the Nephilim. Now, there is an alternate understanding of that, and I'm not making any judgments for the viewer, though I have my own personal ideas, that the sons of God were in fact the sons of Seth, the ones who remained faithful to God, and the daughters of men were the daughters of Cain, who killed his brother Abel. And yes, those are the two ideas, that it was angels and human women, or it was faithful humans and unfaithful humans.
And can I say just as a aside, this is very untheological, but the sequence that is portrayed showing the angels getting with these women, I was watching this and thinking this could be like a Calvin Klein ad. Like you could have the angels half naked. To be clear, for those people who haven't watched it, these are like almost completely nude, very muscled, very let's say steamy men seeing women and going, "Hey, what's up?" And it honestly looks like they got a bunch of male models to basically portray this sequence, because that's what it looks like.
Have they not seen the biblically accurate angels
I know.
memes?
It's like they're not even trying.
Like wheels within wheels and eyes all around the wheels, and all of that sort of stuff. Angels that
Yeah.
freak you.
So that's
But,
one set of characters, and we can go back to that if we have time. But I do want to talk about some of the characters because there are a number of characters in this show that either are just total inventions or like heavily interpreted to very specific lengths. I want to start with David's mother. So David's
Yes.
mother is just as an aside, the whole motivation for David's father for wanting to keep him at home, the guilt around her and her death. I mean, I think we're beyond spoilers at this point. David's mother dies basically very, very early on in a flashback, and it's linked to his killing of the lion, which is a very famous little boast that he has in the biblical story, but it's given much more resonance. I don't know if they're the bear. It's a lion and a bear, but I don't know the bear is given as much respect as the lion,
not so
which is a
much,
shame.
no.
But either way, David's mother. What do we actually know about her? Do we know anything at all about her? Because having only really read the Bible story as a kid and a couple times as a grown-up, this came out of nowhere for me, this whole character.
So there is some Talmudic literature to suggest that David was born in sin or born in shame. Now, someone can correct me in the comment section because the best way to get the correct information is to say something wrong. It's suggested that she was
she was an enemy, like some kind of foreigner.
Well, it wouldn't have been out of place because David's great grandmother was a Moabite.
Right, Ruth and Boaz, right?
Yes, so Boaz, Obed, his son, Jesse, his son, who is David's father. So, yeah, there is definitely the stain of being descended from a non-Israelite in David's family. But apart from David possibly being born in sin, there's not really much. Information,
and clearly we don't have the entire sequence with her dying. Like that is not discussed even in the Talmudic literature.
Not that I'm aware of, although feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. It's interesting the reason as to why David was out in the fields as well. I'm gonna share this. I can't remember what book it came from, but it was recommended to me to read 14 years ago when I was at college by one of the lecturers. The book actually suggests that David was an embarrassment to the family because he wasn't entirely right in the head. The book suggests that when Eliab says to David, "Oh, you just came here to watch the battle," implies that David liked violence.
Oh.
David was a man of blood, as God calls him as to why he's not going to build the temple later on in David's life. David was a man of blood, therefore a peaceful man should build God's temple, who is a God of peace.
I guess it makes sense if David boasts about his killing of wildlife.
Well, we have to understand that they didn't see animals the same way that we see them now. We see animals as being creatures in their own right, worthy of protection and respect and all of that. Creatures were either useful back then or they were pests. And lions were pests. They would they would cause a physical loss of wealth to you. We must remember that coinage didn't exist back then. Your wealth was in what you could bring out of the ground or what you could grow from your flocks. So if the lion keeps on taking your flocks, if a bear keeps on taking your flocks, they are pests. They need to be exterminated. There was no such thing as trying to save the wildlife, save the animals, all of that sort of thing. That would have been frankly ridiculous to an Israelite. Even as recently as the early modern period, the Europeans have been quite proud of the fact that we've been able to wipe out wolves from the continent until fairly recently we've started to reintroduce them.
So
opinions are divided how good an idea that is.
Yeah, if Eliav is kind of being a little bit sly about sort of insinuating things about David, if this theory has any validity to it, then we have to assume that there's something else going on that we're not privy to, perhaps, about David and his character or his tendencies. So, which I guess would make sense because David does go on to become a very successful person at ending the lives of other persons. He does it frequently and at great volume. So perhaps
more so than is required of him too.
Yes, especially when it comes to certain parts of the body that are connected to vital parts. I'm interested to see how that will be portrayed in the show. If you know, you know. If you don't worry about it. Okay, so that's David's mother. I want to also discuss Saul's family because I did find the tension in Saul's family quite interesting. So Saul has 2 sons that we are introduced to and 2 daughters. I will say, out of all the characters in the show, personally, I found the actor who portrayed Saul probably to portray him to the most of what I ever imagined him as a character. I really, it's not that I enjoyed his portrayal. I guess I enjoyed his portrayal. Like, Saul is a difficult man. He's a troubled and very complicated man. And I think the actor actually did a fantastic job of portraying both his madness as well as his regret, his sadness, his longing for a simple life. There's all these very complicated emotions going on that I think were portrayed quite well for what it's worth.
And I like the idea that is put forward in House of David that Saul's madness comes from holding on to something that he's supposed to let go of. I think that's absolutely a fair take to make of it. Rulers have the sword of Damocles hanging over their head often enough to know that that sword is going to fall on you and that another is going to take your place. If you love what you do and if you love the power and if you come from a humble place and you don't want to go back to that humble place, and if you know what happens to kings after they are deposed, now I can understand why Saul would not want to give up his rule, not only for his own sake, but also for his family's sake.
So you did mention in the article how sometimes Saul's madness is used as a plot device to create tension that probably didn't need to be created. The other thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on was, again, I mean, spoilers in this zone. Agag is portrayed as a sort of personified evil spirit that haunts Saul. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the story in the Bible pretty much just says an evil spirit comes. I think it's implied that God actually sends the spirit to Saul in order to trouble him. Agag is not implicated in this in any way, shape, or form in the biblical story, right? And so what do you think of this portrayal?
I can understand it. I mean, obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about Freudian psychology. And they're never going to pay lip service to Freudian psychology because it's fourth wall breaking. But you could interpret Agag to be an expression of Saul's Thanatos instinct. His belief that he is going to die and his fixation on death finds its personification in Agag. So I get that in that sense. And I think the way that his madness is portrayed does actually set up the coming conflicts with Daniel rather well when he, spoiler alert, spears a servant because he thinks that servant is somebody else. There's really it's a really interesting portrayal almost of PTSD even. Saul, as a king, has to be a man of violence, has to be a man of blood. And as a result, he perceives people to be threats when they are not. And I don't wish to speak for the experience of those with PTSD. I've never suffered from it, and I don't in any way wish to describe something that I haven't experienced, but it seems to me that from the way it's been described to me, that's possibly what they're going for.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Saul is forced to be a violent person, but I think the show actually does a pretty good job of portraying the fact that he's ill-suited to it. Like he really doesn't. He doesn't want to do a lot of the things that he has to do, but he feels like he has to in order. It's almost like the instinct of a mob boss to prove that he's like the toughest nut out there, so that one of his made men doesn't come and try and knock him off or whatever. And that dynamic definitely gets explored in the show in one particular scene that I'm thinking of with the tribal leader. So Saul, yeah, his madness is obviously a complicated topic to explore, but and sometimes I think it's used well, and sometimes it's not used that well. The other characters that I wanted to touch on is Saul's son. So there's Jonathan, of course. We all know about Jonathan. He ends up becoming David's best mate. That kind of gets referenced a little bit in the show, but they're still sort of at odds a little bit. There's definitely tension between David, who knows that he's destined to succeed, and Jonathan, who's trying to be the dutiful prince and struggling with sort of the duties of supporting his father and potentially becoming king one day. But then there's this younger brother, and I think is his name Eshbal?
Eshbal,
is
yes.
This biblical character that we're introduced to? Because again, this is another character I was not actually that paying attention to in the biblical story.
Yes, so there's actually a convention in the writers of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings that they will not portray a heathen deity's name in a positive way. Mm-hmm. So, for example, like Baal-zebul, which is a particular iteration of the pagan god Baal, is translated to, like, it's changed to Baal-zebub, Lord of the Flies, for example, which is from whence we get the name Beelzebub. So this happens in Saul's family. So Eshbal is actually Ishbosheth.
Oh.
Who is the claimant to Saul's throne after Saul dies. David goes to war with Ishbosheth because Ishbosheth claims to be
the successor.
Obviously, he's with throne while Saul, therefore he claims the throne. This is interesting when you look at the rest of Saul's family. There's two things I'd like to bring up. Number one is the name of Saul's sons. He has 4 that we are aware of. So we have Jonathan. Now, Jonathan, if I'm not mistaken, means Yahweh has gifted. So that's Yahweh has gifted. God has given me a son. Then you have Malchishua, which means the king saves. Then you have Abinadab, which means my father is beneficent, he gives good gifts. And then you have Eshbal, man of Baal. So in Saul's family, his wife Ahinoam is portrayed as being the Baal worshipper. But it is entirely possible that Saul himself has become a Baal worshipper by this time all of his sons are born. Eshbal being his 4th son, man of Baal.
Okay. And do we know whether one name was more predominant than the other? Was Ishbosheth like a later addition to kind of cover up the scandal, or?
Exactly so, because they will not speak of pagan deities as being good. The writers of history will not do it. So they have said Ish, man, Boseth, shame, man of shame, instead of
Eshbal
man of
is likely the earlier rendering of the name. Wow.
I believe it's written that way in Chronicles.
That's interesting.
Now, this leads us to a very interesting realization about Jonathan's son. Who was Jonathan's son who was crippled?
Mephibosheth?
Yep. And do we know what that means?
No idea.
The other name for Mephibosheth is Meribah,
Oh, okay.
because it still has that Bosheth in there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's entirely possible that Jonathan himself became a Baal worshipper.
Interesting. One of the things that I am vaguely aware of from a biblical research perspective is the fact that it's pretty likely that pretty much the entire time the Israelites were in Canaan, up until the conquest, there was pretty widespread polytheism going on basically everywhere. And obviously, there was some pretty concerted efforts by various kings to consolidate worship at various times. But I guess how widespread, in your view, from what you've read in terms of worship practices, how widespread was polytheism during this time? Because I think most people watching this, if they're from a Christian perspective or even secular people, would probably have to assume that, oh, okay, it's Israel, therefore they're going to worship the God of Israel. There's nothing else going on there. And that's not the case, really, is it?
No. So we actually see this narrative play out pretty early on in the Judges. God gives the Israelites victory in battle. Then when they have peace, they forget God. Then he hands them over to their enemies. They cry out to God. They get victory in battle once again. Once they have peace, a judge who leads them in God's name keeps them faithful until that judge passes on. And then they're unfaithful once again. They are handed into the hands of their enemies. They call out to God yet again, and they're delivered. This is the account that happens in the Judges. Now, what we need to understand is that, yes, in fact, the Israelites did have a very good reason in their own eyes to turn to other gods. And that is because they did not perceive of Yahweh as being a God who had dominion over everything.
Mm-hmm.
The account of the Judges tells us that he does and that he wants to be with them, that he wants to give them his blessings in everything. But they don't see that because they are too warped by the way their own culture works. And the way their own culture works is Yahweh is the God of battle. So if you need victory in battle, you call on him. But he's not the God of crops.
Mm-hmm.
He's not the God of fertility.
Early on, he's perceived as almost Baal-like, right? He's a storm god deity.
Storm god, god of blacksmithing, god of war is what we've suggested that Yahweh was originally thought of by the Israelites as. Of course, we understand from the overarching narrative of the Bible and from the history of God's people that this wasn't the case. He wanted to be seen as more. And every time his people made him their priority, he blessed them in everything. We see in the book of Kings the account of Elijah going up, setting up the altar, having fire fall from heaven. Yahweh, he is God. Then Yahweh brings the rains. Yahweh had shut up the heavens, which was Baal's domain. Baal was the one who was supposed to bring the storms, bring the rains. Yahweh stops Baal from being able to do that for 3.5 years. And then, once Israel acknowledges Yahweh, he brings the rains again. So there is a pretty clear story throughout the entire Old Testament that Yahweh has supreme power and he wants his people to recognize it. But they keep going off and worshipping other gods because that is the way that the people of the time thought of these things. There was no God with supreme unchallenged power. At the very least, they believed that Yahweh or El, God, had a wife, Asherah, and a son, Baal, and they ruled together. And we see this in most of the pagan deities of the ancient Near East. In Babylon, for example, we have Marduk, the chief god, his wife Ishtar, and their son Bel. So the Israelites have bought into this idea that you need to have a divine family ruling. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, some people actually see that as I have no family. I have no wife that I share power with, that I need to rely on for power. And this is, so it's pretty signposted fairly early on that Yahweh needs not share his power with anyone, and yet the Israelites insist on doing that.
It's almost like the same kind of sentiment of, the Israelites needing a king when God doesn't want them to.
He doesn't need them to. And he knows well what's going to happen if they do get a king.
So let's bring it back to the show, because we unfortunately...
Yes, sorry, I went
No. I love it. I'm here for it. Let's go back to, I guess, we could talk about horses and armor and leather straps and all that sort of stuff, but I don't think we really have time, unfortunately.
And I covered that in detail in as much detail as necessary.
If you really want to nerd out about that stuff, go read Mitch's article. I think the thing that I want to end on is where you land the plane in your article, and that's on the show's portrayal about God. Because God is a character that shows up in a couple of different places in the show. He shows up mysteriously and not obviously. But the main issue, well, I shouldn't put words in your mouth, so perhaps I should just simply ask, what's your main issue with the show when it comes to the portrayal of God?
So main issue, as I see it, when it comes to how God is shown, is that God is very much a vehicle for human ambition, if that makes sense, or for humans to realize what they're capable of. And you see this in the arc words over the series, that David is encouraged to rise, to be who he was meant to be. That's a very human-centered perspective.
It's very Disney.
Yes, it pays rich service to God. Yeah, God intended him to be someone, but it never really focuses on why David is meant to be that person, is because he puts his trust in God and he lets God lead. It's very much shown that David is an underdog. It could have been made more explicit that there was no way in heck that he was going to end up being king of Israel. Although the parallels are there if you look at the biblical story. Saul started out as a herder of donkeys. David started out as a herder of sheep. When you look at what the show is trying to do, God, and to a greater extent, to a certain extent, supernatural as well, is very much just a vehicle for humans to do their thing, or to provide a just so explanation as to why things happen. Everything's so convenient. It doesn't really make logical sense why certain people would act in certain ways. It's like I say in the article, David was a man after God's own heart. I don't think House of David knows what God's heart was. And I think that's the main problem with what the show does, and I'll be interested to see how it treats David's failings, how it treats his affair with Bathsheba, how it treats the revolt of Absalom, the things that David really needs to go to God for. I think that's going to be telling, because it's easy to say that God was giving David everything he needed in his rise to power. But does that look like when David's not doing so well? Is it going to be clearly portrayed as David's unfaithfulness to God, or is it going to be something else? And to me, the show falls into almost that moralistic, therapeutic deist trap of, if you have God in your life, then everything will be fine, which is the lie that we tell ourselves as Christians. To break down that expression, because it's a bit wordy, moralistic means if you're a good person. Therapeutic, you'll feel better. Deism, it's a transactional relationship with God, or God follows certain rules, if that makes sense. So a moralistic, therapeutic deism says that if I do what God wants me to, then God will make my life better. And I very much see that David seems to fall into that trap a little bit. David does what God wants. David is the anointed one. Therefore, David's life is going to be great. He's going to get the girl, all of that. He's going to defeat Goliath. He's going to inspire the Israelite army, all of that sort of thing. But all of that was to call the Israelites back to faithfulness with God. He was meant to be a leader to call the Israelites back to God. That hasn't been elaborated on yet. I'll reserve judgment until I see it, but that's what I see at the moment.
If somebody's listening to this and they're still not sure, should I see the show? Should I skip it? What would you say?
I'd watch it. Don't expect it to be a true and accurate representation of the time. It says as much. Don't expect it to be on the level of Game of Thrones. Don't expect it to be on the level of Chosen. Temper your expectations, and you probably find something to enjoy about it.
Well, if you want to hear a little bit more about what Mitch has to say, as mentioned, the article is where you should go. You'll be able to find much more information about horses and leather straps and Roman armor. So if that's your thing, you will have many treasures to plumb. Aside from that, thank you, Mitch, for spending the time with us today. I appreciated your expertise and your analysis.
A pleasure as always.